So why should you care about all this? Well, Envision 2060 is one reason. This is the document that was produced by a group from the University of Washington, funded by the EPA, to serve as a basis for planning for the future of Skagit County in various areas. So let's look at what's in that particular report and test it to see if it in fact the conclusions are valid. They say in the introduction of their report that their report is based on climate change scenarios, not evidence or data, from the IPCC. The IPCC is the UN agency that puts out a climate report about every 2 to 4 years. The last one was just this last year in September of 2013. The one that they are using for basis was published in 2007. In that report, the average temperature rise is predicted to be 7.5 degrees warmer by 2060. That's huge. That would be catastrophic. We had to, you know, that's getting close to 2 or 3 degrees per decade. By 2000 or by 2100, they're predicting 10 degrees warmer, which would indeed be catastrophic. For comparison, we've been in a little ice age, a cold period, since about 1500 AD, and we're thawing out from that now. And the rate at which we're thawing out, we're still well below where the average is for the past 10,000 years, but the amount of warming that we're seeing is about 1 degree Fahrenheit per 100 years. And they're suggesting 7.5 degrees by 2060, which is only 46 years from now. That's huge. We can test the validity of the basis for the 2060 report by testing the basis of the IPCC report, because Envision 2060 is based on that report. So if we look at the qualifications of the IPCC members, the UN committee, they themselves admit that 80% of those members are not scientists. It's not a scientific body, it's an activist body. They claim that the IPCC reports are entirely peer-reviewed with the best literature, results, and data that they can find. Somebody did a count of their references that they use, and 1/3 of them were not even peer-reviewed. There were magazine articles, there were activist reports, all kinds of junk that we wouldn't even call science. On top of that, we have problems with data tampering by NOAA and NASA. And that may shock you. That's kind of like saying motherhood and apple pie is bad. But I'll show you some examples. I don't want to dwell on it, but I want to make you aware of the fact that both NOAA and NASA doctor their data to make it look warmer than it really is. That's the bottom line. And we can now test the climate model predictions by the UN body, which they've been making now for anywhere from 10 to 20 years. It's been a long enough time so we can test their predictions from 10 years ago with what has actually happened to the climate during that time period to see if their predictions were correct. And what we'll see is that they fail miserably. Furthermore, the IPCC report is based entirely on the assumption that global warming is caused by rising CO2. And we'll talk a bit about the details of that. Here's how NOAA and NASA cook the data. And I don't want to get bogged down in this, just to bring to your attention what they do. This is NOAA data, and the blue curve here is the data that was actually measured. And one of the points of contention is that in the 1930s, you can't see the dates down here, but this is the time period. Warm is up and colder is down. The 1930s were the warmest decade of this century, not the past decade. The 1930s were warmer. I'll show you the data for that. And so it's an embarrassment that it's been warmer in the early part of the century when there was no increase in CO2 than there is right now. And so there is an email that came out in the ClimateGate scandal in which they say the 1930s and 40s warm period is an embarrassment that we have to get rid of. They actually say that. And sure enough, they did. Because what they did was they changed this curve of actual observed data to this curve right here. Now, if you look here, these are the 1930s. Look how high this is. Here's the first decade of this century, 2000 or 2010. And notice that it was hotter in the 1930s than it was at present. So look what happens when you drop this down. Suddenly, recently, it's hotter than it was earlier. Data tampered. The same thing here. This is the original measured data, the blue line, and the 2014 NASA curve dropped it down here to get rid of that inconvenient warm period in the 1930s. So what they do is they subtract temperatures from the 1930s and 40s, shown here in blue. This is if they make the temperature, the measured temperature cooler, then it shows here in blue. If they make it warmer, then it's shown here in red. And here's the effect of that. The blue curve here slants down. That means it's been cooling. Temperature is getting cooler. And what they did was they subtracted a bunch of temperature from this to bring it down here. And the net result is it looks like today is warmer than it used to be, and in fact it wasn't. There's no smoking gun that CO2 is causing global warming. There's no physical evidence of CO2 causing global warming. All there is are computer models. And you know what they say about computers? Garbage in, garbage out. A computer will spit out what you tell it to. And so the UN group runs a lot of really expensive computer model simulations about climate. And this is the result that they get. This is temperature over here on the left-hand side. So as the curve goes up, that means it's getting warmer. And the red line here is the average of 90 of their climate models. This is what the climate models were telling it. The blue line here and the green line here are satellite temperature measurements. So we can now compare their model predictions with measurements made from satellites, which are really the only trustworthy ones. And there's a huge gap between the two. The climate models upon which virtually all of the predictions of doom and gloom are based, almost all of those climate models failed miserably to come anywhere near. They weren't even within a degree over 10 years of what the climate observed. So remember our axiom about science? If there is an exception of the observed data to the concept, then it's wrong. This proves that the climate models are wrong. Doesn't prove the whole concept is wrong. It proves our climate models are wrong, essentially worthless. Here's another one that shows the same thing. The black line here shows temperature rising according to their model predictions. Here's the actual measured climate. In this case, it's actually cooling. And here's the difference between what the model said it was going to be by 2012, and here's the real temperature in 2012. A huge difference. The models fail miserably. They've also made a lot of predictions based on those models. And here are a few of them. And I'm not going to read them all, but in a nutshell, what they're saying is that there isn't going to be any more winter. The next generation isn't going to know what snow looks like. The skiers are all going to have to shut down because there's not going to be enough snow. Skiing among the palm trees. White Christmases are a thing of the past. 50 million people worldwide will be displaced by 2010 because of rising sea level. Have you noticed 50 million people migrating from the shorelines by 2010? The increase in average temperature near the Earth's surface will be 7 degrees, and this could raise sea level 10 feet. Goodbye, New York and Washington, D.C. Not a bad idea, but I don't think that it's going to happen. So, at any rate, there are also a bunch of atolls, low-lying atolls in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans that are afraid that they're going to be submerged by sea level rise. And we'll look at the truth of that also. There are claims made that Himalayan glaciers will will vanish by the year 2000. Well, they didn't. Matter of fact, they're growing. The statement has been made, or the claim has been made, that all alpine glaciers will have melted away by 2100. No more alpine glaciers. However, the fact is that glaciers are growing in Tibet recently. Glaciers are growing in Norway. Glaciers are growing in Alaska, and some glaciers in the Andes are growing. Not all of them, because there is a lag between the time a glacier advances and retreats and what happens to the snowfall and the temperature, and we'll come back to that. The alarmists, which are the CO2 people, claim that the polar ice caps are melting rapidly, which is going to cause dramatic sea level rise. Here's a statement made in 2009 by Al Gore. The North Pole ice cap is 40% gone already and could be completely and totally gone in the winter months in the next 5 to 10 years. Well, 5 years, that's this year. What's wrong with that? There is no ice cap at the North Pole. So how could it be 40% gone? And why are we worried about losing it? Because it isn't there to start with. Here's what's at the North Pole. It's the Arctic Ocean, and there's a meter or two of floating sea ice, and that's it. There are no glaciers at the North Pole. Not only that, but if we look at the Arctic region in general, Iceland and Greenland, where there are glaciers, then we find that the temperature there has risen and fallen systematically. It hasn't been constant at all. It hasn't changed only recently. And in fact, if you look at the shape of this curve, up means warmer. So here's a trend of this curve going up. That means it's getting warmer till about 1945, and then it got colder till about 1977, and then it started getting warm again, and then recently it's been getting cold again. What you'll notice is the same thing that was true in North America. It was warmer in the 1930s than it was in the first decade of this century. Nothing unusual. It's business as usual. It doesn't matter. Here's another temperature curve of Greenland. This is 1920, 1940. It was warmer in Greenland in the 1930s than it was in 2000. Again, the same thing as the global climate. There's nothing unusual going on in Greenland. It's been doing this up and down for thousands of years. In fact, if we look at the Arctic summer temperatures, here's 1993. Down means that it's getting cooler. It's been cooling in the Arctic, not warming. Here is the Arctic temperature since 2006. This is satellite data, and it's down. This is a different scale. So this is 1 degree, and so the difference between here and here is actually pretty significant. It's almost well, a little, about 0.8 of a degree, which is quite a bit cooler. The Arctic is not overheating. It's also cooling. There's a lot of emphasis placed on the Arctic shelf ice disappearing, and the possibility that ships can use the Arctic Ocean to shortcut from ocean to ocean, go through there. Chinese did this back in the 1400s, apparently, but that's when it was a lot warmer than it is now. So here's what the ice cap looked like, or not ice cap, get me saying it. Here's what the sea ice looked like in 1979, which was the first year we had satellite data. It was only when we had satellites that we could, for the first time, look at the extent of Arctic sea ice and measure it. And you'll see the Arctic Ocean in 1979 was pretty much covered with sea ice. How different is this? This is last month. Look at the difference. I don't think you're going to swim across the Arctic Ocean or paddle across it. And what you're seeing is that there's a little bit of change. You know, there's a little bit of ice lost here, a little bit here, a little bit gained here and there. And it's down. There's no doubt that we've had warming from 1977 to 1998. And that has, in fact, diminished the Arctic sea ice. Nobody denies that. But not by very much. And it's not at all unusual. It does this all the time. And the claim is made that our friends, the fuzzy polar bears, are going to become endangered by loss of Arctic sea ice. And so here are the pictures that you'll see, and the poor polar bears are going to be dying. They're going to become extinct if we don't do something. However, the polar bears lived for the past 10,000 years almost the entire time 1 or 2 degrees warmer than it is right now when there was less sea ice in the Arctic than there is now. And they did just fine. In fact, if you count them, in 1960s and 70s there were 5,000 known polar bears. Today the latest survey shows that there are about 25,000 plus. And do you know what controls the population of polar bears? It's not how much sea ice, it's not how warm the temperature is, it's how many humans shoot. If you want to save the polar bears, stop shooting them. Very simple. Let's look at the Antarctic ice sheet. There are wild claims being made, even all this week, that the Antarctic ice cap is melting at an accelerating rate and it's going to cause catastrophic sea level rise. Big report out of Tokyo making the news from the IPCC just this week. Antarctica is a continent. It's a land mass. The ice in most of the continent is 10 to 15,000 feet thick. It's a big ice sheet. There's a little thumb that sticks out here called the West Antarctic Peninsula. It makes up a very small part of the total ice in Alaska. And there are warm currents, warm ocean waters that are melting some of that. I'll show you that in a minute. But think what it would take to melt the Antarctic ice cap. The average daily temperature in Antarctica is minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. 58 degrees below freezing is the average. And last winter, the South Pole reached minus 106 degrees, 106 degrees below zero. To get any ice to melt, you have to raise it to the melting point. So you've got to go from minus 58 to plus 32. That's the melting point of ice. And then you have to have another 10 degrees or so to melt any appreciable amount of ice. You would have to raise the temperature of Antarctica 100 degrees to get any appreciable melting of Antarctic ice. How likely do you think it is that Antarctica is going to warm 100 degrees? And that's what that's all based on. Well, let's look at some measurements and see what the data tells us. This is the average annual temperature at the South Pole since 1957. I don't see any warming in that. In fact, in this image, the blue area is a temperature trend where the ice is actually getting colder, or the Antarctica is actually getting colder, and the red is places where it's warmer. Almost the entire East Antarctic ice sheet is getting colder. It's not melting. There's a little bit of melting going on in the West Antarctic Peninsula, this little thumb over here, which is being caused by warm ocean water that's around it and is melting some of the shelf ice from underneath. It's not from air temperature. You may have read about the ships that got stuck in the ice down there. Yeah. Big joke, expensive joke. It's going to cost somebody about $1 million or more for the rescue attempt. Why does that not surprise us? Because this is the curve of the Antarctic ice this year. The Antarctic ice now, and this is sea ice I'm talking about, not the continental glacier, this is the floating ice around the margin, is at an all-time high by this amount, and it's this much above the average for the Antarctic. The Antarctic sea ice is not melting either, any more than the land ice is melting. Antarctica is a unique place. The Antarctic ice sheet has not melted in 15 million years. So why should it melt now? The truth is it's not. And the reason is that it has an unusual circulation. These green things here, little green arrows, are atmospheric movement, wind, if you like. This is what's happening to the wind. And you'll see that there is a strong clockwise motion of air around, all the way around Antarctica. It just keeps going around and around and around. There are some little swirls in it, but by and large, this encircles the entire Antarctic continent. And that stabilizes the Antarctic climate and prevents it from interacting very much with the rest of the Earth's climate. In other words, it's isolated, it's very stable, and it's kept that way by this rather unusual circulation. You can get this in real time on a computer that shows you the actual motion. And if any of you are interested in knowing how to get that, I'd be happy to show you afterwards. Every day I hear quotes that global warming is unprecedented, reaching unprecedented levels. Oops, I didn't want to do that. So we'll go back. And that's not true. the climate for the last 100,000 years or so is very well preserved in the isotope record of Greenland in ice cores, where we can read it and measure it. And the same is true in Antarctica. It goes back much further. It goes back about 600,000 in the Antarctic. This is a reconstruction of past temperatures in Greenland going back to the year 1480, about 500 years roughly. And the red areas here are times when the climate was warmer in Greenland than it is now. Here's the current climate level is shown right here on the edge, the end of this blue line. That's where we are now. Look at the number of times when the climate in the Antarctic, or excuse me, in Greenland has been warmer than the present. And look how many times it's been colder. There are 40 of these, and the 40 swinging back and forth, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, 40 times in the last 500 years. There's nothing unprecedented about this little bit of warming that we're seeing here, and as a matter of fact, it's just a little blip. During the end of the last ice age, there were huge swings in temperature. Red here is above average, this is warming. Blue is below average, cooling. This area encompasses the time from about 10,000 to about 25,000 years ago, during the last big ice age. The ice here in Mount Vernon was 5,000 feet thick during this time. Now all gone. And what we see is that from the height of the last big ice age, there was a sudden dramatic warming that caused the temperature to rise from way down here to way up here. And that rise was something like 25 degrees Fahrenheit in 100 years. 25 times what we've seen in the past century. So whenever you see unprecedented global warming, it's simply not true. It's not even close. It's just a little blip. Here is the temperature reconstruction for the last 10,000 years based on the Greenland ice core. And we know the temperature from the measurement of oxygen isotopes. The red areas here are areas when it was warmer in Greenland than it is today. Here's where we are today, right about here. And by about 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, maybe even 3 degrees, warmer than now for 8,500 years of the last 10,000. It was much warmer than it is today, and the Earth survived it. Then we went into the little ice age, which is right here, and we've just now recently been thawing out from that. But we're nowhere near back to where we have been for most of the last 10,000 years. So the conclusions we can draw from this is that the IPCC report, which is the base for the 2060, Envision 2060 report, is based on computer model data that is invalid. Even the IPCC, who made these computer models, now admits their computer models missed the boat by not a little bit, but by a lot. They weren't even close. And that forms the basis for the entire Envision 2060 report. So if the IPCC report is not valid, then neither is the Envision 2060. And I'll show you some of the details in a minute.